look at that. Our friends are here. Welcome to Friends Talking Nerdy. This is Tim the Nerd, and I am joined by the Reverend Tracy. We are continuing Education Month this week, and we are going to be talking about something that anybody involved in education, whether it be student or teacher alike, has probably experienced at some point, and that is burnout. And we're going to be asking ourselves, why can't we simply push through exhaustion? Now, today, we're talking about something that I suspect a lot of people listening have experienced, as I just mentioned. Even if they don't call it burnout at the time, you're exhausted, you're overwhelmed, you don't particularly want to do anything, but there's still stuff that needs to get done. So what do? You push through. You tell yourself, I'll rest when I'm finished. And then you finish one thing, and there's another thing, and another thing, and another thing, and another thing. Eventually, you realize you've been saying, I'll rest when I'm finished for about 6 months. And at that point, you're not really sure what finished even means anymore. So today's big question is, why can't we simply push through exhaustion? Because we've been taught that pushing through is a virtue. Work harder, get it done, don't quit, sleep when you're dead. And apparently, whoever came up with that last one had never heard of preventative maintenance. Because your body is not a lawnmower. You can't just keep running it until something starts making a horrible noise. Although some of us have apparently decided that horrible noise is just our personality now. Now, when you hear somebody say, I'm burned out, what does that phrase mean to you?
Well, see, Tim, I worked in the tech industry. So in my
I did
head,
too.
I think about, like how that produces burnout. So see, here we go. We've got another topic that's a little bit education geared, but still has massive application to people that are not currently in like an education system form of learning. Like we're all learning, but we're all, and so if you've got that growth mindset and everything with that, but a lot of these concepts should apply to the other way that we've heard burnout, right? Like I'm burned out at work. Like you're working and you're working and you're pushing through. And I know when I was for a little minute there in the tech world, the whole CSM, the customer success management career path was being kind of created. And especially at the work that I was at. And I still remember like being hit because this is where this comes from too, right? Like sometimes it's not your own messages that is leading to like over pushing yourself. Sometimes it's the teacher responding to your question. In my case, it was the lead when I told him I did not feel prepared to do this presentation, client facing presentation on how our stuff works. Because basically, I was so overloaded with work, I was never able to, quote, go in and play with the program as I was promised so that I could speak with confidence on how it worked. And his response was like I was basically almost in tears, which I don't cry in front of people. Like that's mortifying to me. Some people would rather die than public speak. I would rather die than cry in front of somebody ever. That's always been a problem with my therapist. But yeah, like, and I just remember like just being in front of him, like kind of shaking and like kind of feeling that anxiety build up. And he just went, "You got this, though." Like really, that is such the pull yourself up by your bootstraps without saying it in such a way that was just amazing. And we do this to other people, whether we realize it or not accidentally, because sometimes like our encouragement is the thing that's pushing them to keep pushing instead of recognizing that their body is showing signs of needing rest. Because that's what some of this is that we're going to talk about. Burnout, those symptoms, is really just your body's way of saying, this is too much, strict for too long. So, yeah, that's what I think of. And really, too much for too long is such the perfect little definition of burnout. It's just too much for too long.
Agreed on that. I mean, to your point, there is definitely parallels between a student, cramming for a test of some sort or dealing with projects that a professor puts out. It's comparable to what you just said. Somebody at work doing a presentation for a boss or doing some training for a boss or something like that, and burnout is definitely a real thing, especially when, we're talking about, like if we're talking on the work side, big corporations, because they don't want to give you the time or the resources necessarily to complete projects. They just want it done. And if there's anybody out there that's a big proponent of the pull yourself up by your bootstraps mentality, it is big corporations, because
Mm.
they don't care about your mental health, because frankly they got hundreds of people that they could probably fill your spot with if you decide it's not enough for you, so they don't care.
Yeah, I think what happened, unfortunately, in our tech world was tech got a rep for being really cool to work for because it was a bunch of small businesses owned by the very nerds that used to feel effectively mistreated. Right? And so they did all these things like, oh my gosh, come on. I worked in a place that had a kegerator like in it. And there's an office guideline of please refrain from drinking before 3 p.m., which is only hilarious when you know the definition of refrain is to make an attempt not to do something. And to try to refrain is therefore make an attempt to make an attempt to not drink before 3 p.m. But and then what happened? What happened? What happened is it got big, and then big corporations wanted to invest. So then, like for example, when I worked for this one little tech company that eventually got bought by somebody that you may have heard of called HP that split off to HPE. And then the first thing they did when they came in talking about, I love your tech culture, is like, yeah, we got to change all this. I was like, why would you change it? It's working well. But see, that's kind of what can happen. And I think that's what happened in tech. I don't think it started as something that burned out. I think it had that influence outside. So whether it's a boss telling you can do it, or a teacher telling you can do it, right? And you'd like to think the teacher telling you can do it is really of a better place, right? Like they are probably genuinely trying to encourage you. And that's almost that perfect little dichotomy of where that burnout stress can come from surprising places sometimes. It's not always the boss screaming deadlines and you have to do this. Sometimes it is the teacher, it's the cheerleader, it's the friend saying, like, you can do this, as in they believe in you, but it can add to that same pressure.
Yeah, and that is the thing too. I mean, we talked about last week about stress and everything like that. Stress is going to come with any sort of big project that you have, and yeah, you don't want to quit at the first, signs of stress popping up or anything like that. And having people there for you to kind of cheerlead for you, saying, "Hey, you do got this," and stuff like that is not inherently bad. But when we're talking about a boss or something like that that just cares about it getting done, so they can hit their own numbers, or depending on the educational situation we're talking about, maybe I mean, I'm sure there are professors out there that are hard asses and don't care and whatnot. That could easily lead to burnout and all that stuff.
Right, because there are the professors that are like, you must pass my class, and my class is hard, and I have pride in my class being hard. So that does exist. I kind of had a few of those in my college career. So
Yeah, I had one, and then I promptly left that class.
I
but
mean,
yeah, different story for a different day here. But I think this is an important place to start, because being tired, having a bad day, being stressed, and actually experiencing burnout aren't necessarily the same thing. Now, kind of piggybacking off of what you talked about with people casually throwing out psychological terms these days, we use the word burnout pretty casually. People say, "I'm burned out on this restaurant. I'm burned out on this television show. I'm burned out from work. I'm burned out from people." Sometimes we're just basically saying, "I've had enough of this." But psychological burnout is more serious. The World Health Organization describes burnout as an occupational phenomenon resulting from chronic workplace stress that hasn't been successfully managed. And traditionally, researchers describe burnout through three major dimensions: emotional exhaustion, cynicism or detachment. I guess I've been burned out for life, and reduced professional efficacy. In plain English, you're exhausted. You start emotionally checking out, and you begin feeling like you're not even good at what you're doing anymore. Now, why do you think burnout often gets mistaken for laziness?
so burnout being mistaken for laziness is, I think, a lot to do with our culture, really, right? Because it goes into we really seem to punish like when somebody can't do something. This goes back into some of the concepts we talked about with the pulling yourself up by your bootstraps episodes. It's funny that I already used that term up earlier, right? Like that we do look at people that you're unable to do something. Therefore, there just must be something wrong with you because we do really want to believe that we have a lot more control over our situation than we actually have. Right? Like we need that. We've talked about the biases that kind of stay in our brain that build that kind of fantasy world around us. And so that's what's kind of interesting is then there is not a false sense of being judged, right, by the person being judged, because right, we kind of talk about sometimes how we're our own worst critic and that potentially people aren't judging you as harshly. But unfortunately, in this situation, when it comes to motivation and things like that, and people not understanding just wanting to quit, right, um, we do kind of know that we're being judged for that on a level. So that's not for nothing. It's not like, oh, well, you're making it up and most people don't care. Like, fun fact, actually, most people don't care if your child screams in a grocery store. It kind of depends on how you choose to deal with it. But generally speaking, most people do understand that your child is going to go through a phase where they're just going to go off sometimes. And that's just all neurologically where they are. And there's going to maybe be a few people that are glaring assholes that don't understand child development. And that's okay. Let them not understand. But I do think, unfortunately, more people are ready to judge what they perceive as laziness than the other situation I was just talking about, which feels like it would be more mortifying and more often thought negatively on. But yeah, our understanding of things and motivation is a little bit skewed. We really do kind of have this pull yourself up by your bootstraps narrative when it comes to work and even like following your own interests has kind of been looped in there too, because there is like an overwhelming pressure as a parent, especially a mother, to like do your stuff, which is a narrative that I don't necessarily agree with. I have my own opinions on like, the few years after you had a kid where I think it's actually kind of okay. We talked about it a little bit in the postpartum depression episode where I feel like there's a part of that that makes sense. But right, like there's a lot of external pressure from people when they don't understand why you won't just. And I'm doing the hand symbol for like underlining just because we have a bit of an ism in our household of if you're justing something, you're probably speaking from a place of privilege.
Yeah, and
Right. If you're saying, if you just, well, guess what? For you, it might just be that easy, but that's not the case. That's not everybody's reality. And I think that's why we're so quick to judge people because we want it to be just as easy as just doing something.
well, one, you could be a perfect game show, demonstrator or something like that with that hand gesture that you had there. This is your prize. But in terms of the laziness deal, like I think society, if anything, you want to blame society because you have. If we're talking the work, the work side of things, you have if people are looking at you as lazy, they're not taking into account, the stresses that the person that they're judging, is going through for whatever reason. They're just thinking you should just do this. You should pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Why can't you just do this job?
Right. And so there's a biological element here, by the way, that we're totally disregarding when we have that mentality, because the biological piece underneath this that gets lost when we talk about burnout, especially if we talk about as just being tired, is your system, like your stress system is designed to help you mobilize resources when something demands them, like in the immediate. And that is a good thing, right? It's helped us like survive a lot of predators that helped us get to the top of the food chain, not complaining about that. The problem is when the demand doesn't stop and your body keeps having to adapt over and over. And researchers call the cumulative wear and tear from that repeated activation allostatic load. That was something I got to learn in this. Burnout is information. Your body isn't just saying, I'm sleepy. It's responding to a mismatch between what you're continually asking it to do and the resources available to keep doing it. And there's researchers out there like Bruce McElwen from Rockefeller University, and like he helped develop the whole allostatic load framework. And allostasis is how the body maintains stability by continually adjusting to demands. Again, this isn't a bad thing. We're adaptable machines, right? Your brain is an efficiency computer, and like the rest, that's also just built to adapting, right? But allostatic load is that cumulative psychological cost of doing that repeatedly across like all of your systems, right? Like it's kind of interesting what they found was that this affects like your immune system, your metabolic system, and your cardiovascular systems. Like this is a health topic, right? And there is no single validated biological burnout test, by the way, which is, I guess, part of the reason why burnout is not like diagnostic. Right? They're trying to like do biomarker research, like with cortisol, which is like one of my favorite things to kind of nerd out about in a way. But unfortunately, that's inconsistent. So, basically, your body isn't failing because it's responding to stress. We've talked about it in the past. Our brain is dumb. It's going to respond to stress from an email that you're getting from your boss or from your teacher, or hey, we've upped the due date on this, or hey, I'm adding this new thing to this assignment that you have. Like it's going to respond the same way to that as a tiger jumping out of the bush to attack you at the park. Like just incredibly dumb. So, yeah, your body isn't failing because it responded to a stressor. The problem is when adaptation becomes your new lifestyle. And that's what we seem to be kind of running in this cycle of exhaustion in our culture because we're being told constantly to adapt, not to respond, release, and recover. And that is super important when you are stressed. And these are things they used to teach to people that work at high stress jobs. But I think what we're failing to notice and get the information out there is that everybody's life is becoming more stressful right now just because of how things have changed, right? So yeah, it goes back to that whole thing of like we don't live in a bubble. There's a lot of stressors around us too. And so yeah, we're not failing. Our body's not failing. It's not malfunctioning. It's working how it should. We just need to change our environment around us because we need to find a way to reduce the length of time in which we are experiencing constant stress. And with the feed at your phone, it's so hard to put it down, even though all the science in the world can say this is bad and you should stop doing this. People simply don't. Yeah, buddy, that
That's
probably
right.
came through. Yeah, he's excited.
Yeah,
Get
excited.
off the
Damn.
phones while he's on his tablet.
Yeah. Now, to your point, that is a really important distinction because laziness suggests I could do this, but I don't want to. Burnout can be I desperately want to be able to do this, but I have nothing left. Those are completely different experiences. Now, I think emotional exhaustion deserves its own attention because physical exhaustion is easy to recognize. You worked all day, your feet hurt, your back hurts, you want to sleep. Emotional exhaustion can be so much harder to see. You can sit on the couch all day and still feel completely depleted. You might have spent the day answering emails, managing other people's emotions, making decisions, taking care of family, listening to problems, trying to remain patient, trying to be professional, trying not to snap, and by the end of it, you're exhausted even though you barely moved. Now, have you had one of those days where somebody asks you a completely reasonable question and somehow it feels like they just asked you to rebuild the International Space Station?
So, hi, I'm the parent to a 3-year-old, and let me talk to you about my cognitive overload for the last 3 years. Yeah, like actually, like, so yes, for anybody popping in, 'cause, our listeners have been going up lately. I am a newer parent, so my tie in tends to be a lot to parenting right now. So, that is my experience, and that is my current life filter. But my God, just everything you were explaining took me back to when I was doing the TLDL episodes and I did the invisible job list of a parent. Right? Like so much stuff goes on like in your life. And when you are just simply overwhelmed and burnt out, and granted, kind of the parenting example is a little bit more hyperbolic because you've got like the sleep deprivation, you've got especially the female body, the birthing body has a lot of hormonal and gray matter changes. Not saying anybody who did not physically give birth, not important, just saying we've talked about the neurological and very physical changes that happen. And when you understand that those gray matter shifts happen right over like prefrontal cortex areas that handle like a lot of executive function, it kind of becomes more understandable that you snap more, you yell more. 'Cause, oh my goodness, yes. There have been times, like maybe not necessarily somebody asking me a question that I can think of, but I can point blank tell you that there are times I have reacted to my small child in ways that I am not proud of. And like afterwards, I go, okay, Rev, what the fudge was that about? Like you said you weren't going to do Karen style. And it's so funny how quick you revert back to like how you were treated and how you were done under certain levels of stress. So some of it really is in a way a regression, just trying to find something from the past that yields a predictable result. We've talked about this when we talked about building habits, right? Like our brains don't even need it to be a positive result. It just needs to be consistent, right? Like we crave that cause and effect relationship to play out, and in a way it gives us closure even if it's not good closure. So I've definitely done that.
Oh, me too. Me too. I mean, I've talked about my experiences at Apple, and I just the last couple years there, it was a tightrope walk for me in terms of just trying to survive that mess while trying to keep my sanity. And yeah, it was bad, folks. It was bad. And I'm naturally a cynical person to begin with, and there's nothing wrong with that if you can make jokes about it, I guess, or something like that. But basically, I was getting to the point to where, yeah, I didn't even want to go into work anymore. Like, I'll put it out there. I found out that they had a thing to where if you had a relative pass away, you can get time off and get paid for that time off. So I told them my grandmother died, so I could have a week off.
No, how many times did your grandmother?
No, just the once.
Man, come on, you can pull it off at least 4 times if you convince them you got a step parent.
Yeah, no, I wasn't. I didn't think that far ahead,
I
but
remember thinking about that, like, because you have to remember, guys, like Tim and I are a little bit older, so we have a little bit of that job culture, right? Of like, no, you go to work. I don't care. Like, if you feel like you're dying, you're going to that retail job to give people their change as they buy their shoes and their electronics. Tim and I have both ran that realm of intensity of expectation of showing up for work as if we're running a nuclear site. But
yeah, and to be clear, yeah, it's nice to have a paycheck. It's nice to have have a place to live in, food to eat, clothes on your back, and all that stuff. But too many people get stuck or feel like they're stuck, for whatever reason. Like for me at Apple, I talked about, the stuck feeling was due to the paycheck. And, they did pay, rather decently and all that stuff, but it wasn't worth it to have my mental health just completely trashed.
yeah,
And, I think, to me, that question just kind of brought back those memories. And, that's kind of like the difference between stress and burnout at that point, because you're going to get stressed no matter what type of work that you do, whether you're a student, whether you are, working, whether you are, just the type of person that wants to live in nature. Okay. You're going to have stress. You're going to have stress. It's there.
exactly. There's no escaping it. And actually, if you want to replace stress with suffering, that is actually a Buddhist belief, adage, mentality, something taught is that we all experience suffering. So, in essence, ancient knowledge saying we're all going to experience stress. It's actually a very natural part of life. It would be incredibly weird if we had no stress.
Oh, yes, exactly, exactly. Now, that's where I think people sometimes misunderstand burnout, though. The final straw isn't necessarily the biggest problem. Sometimes you're already carrying 99 pounds and someone hands you one more. That 1 pound didn't create the problem, it just exceeded your capacity. Now, this is where I want to challenge something we've been taught. Just push through, kind of like similar to, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. There are situations where pushing through is absolutely necessary. If you have an important deadline, you may have to finish the project. If someone needs emergency help, you don't get to say, sorry, I'm protecting my boundaries today. Sometimes life requires effort when we're tired, but here's the problem. Emergency effort is not supposed to become your normal operating system. Now, Why do you think people are so proud of being exhausted?
I think there's a work stress model that fits this beautifully, and it's called effort reward imbalance. And that stress isn't determined only by how hard we're working, it also matters whether we're getting enough reward, recognition, security, control, or meaningful return for that effort. And somebody can work incredibly hard and still be relatively okay if they feel supported and the effort is going somewhere. But when the message becomes give more you give, and you'll get nothing back, that's a very different psychological environment. And I feel like that's almost what I was describing that happened with tech industry when it was small versus when it got big, right? Because when it was small, well, yeah, the tech people were giving because I'll tell you my experience with the little place called Aruba Networks that got bought out. Oh my gosh, we had Friday meals that were catered. Yeah, we had the kegerator. And there was like a very healthy drinking culture, by the way, in that place. Like it really was like the more German mentality of, hey, you can go pick a rosé from the cooler if that goes with whatever you ordered from lunch in downtown Portland, Oregon, which was hopping back when I worked there. Right. So, and we had like this awesome coffee machine that we could pretty much to Starbucks level just have it and it comes from the wall. You know what I mean? And we were able to work from home, like kind of as it worked for us. Like it was after pandemic times, so they were able to test it, and tech companies went, yes, like we have been doing. This seems to work for a model. And so they were being given a lot. So of course they produced a lot. And then a big company comes in and says, you produce an awful lot. Wow, we're spending all this money on all this useless shit. We're going to take that away, but you're still going to produce, right? Because, yeah, that was like the lunches went away. And they didn't take away any of the kegerators and stuff, but they took away a lot of events. The CEO came through with stickers and would put a sticker on your monitor every day you worked, but weren't actually there because she thought that was going to make some point about remote work. And all it made us do is like quit. But right. So, like, I think sometimes we get proud of it because we get the sticker charts, we get the rewards, if that makes sense. But yeah, so Johannes Segrist developed that effort reward imbalance model. And it's basically that sustained strain can emerge when high effort pairs with insufficient rewards. And that can be money, esteem, job security, career opportunity, or status. Like, it's not just you get your pizza day or you're getting a raise or you're getting a bonus, because these are the things that we offer that really, by the way, undercut intrinsic value, like where you just have like the value internally rather than having to be paid to do something, right? But the model also includes overcommitment, so excessive striving combined with a strong desire for approval. And research supports this as a useful lens on occupational stress. Though, like, association shouldn't be treated as proof that effort reward imbalance directly causes burnout, but it does kind of lean into the conversation, right? Of what are we doing that is accidentally causing people, or at least a decent amount of them, to like think that this is the goal to strive for, is to being like an overproducer, like, right? Like being like overextended. But yeah, sometimes we call somebody resilient when really what we're actually watching is somebody tolerating an unsustainable exchange rate. And you see this in work, you can see this in education, right? Like, look at the high achieving schools, and they're pretty significant in Portland, Oregon, down where you're at, right? Like, they've made the news a few times, and it's not for nothing. But when you're rewarding a kid and making them feel really awesome because they're taking college courses and doing theater and doing all these things, and they're really like starting to show signs of being burnt out. And instead of, for example, since we are talking about education and this is kind of a known problem in that area, instead of talking to this child and saying, hey, these feelings you're feeling, you're saying you want to be on an anxiety med or that you feel like you need to be on something for depression. However, I'm looking at your schedule and I'm going to tell you, I think you're burning out. And instead of taking a pill or doing something else, the appropriate action to then teach the child is actually, you need to take some of this stuff off your plate. It is not necessary. You know what's necessary? Passing high school. Like literally for any college, for any of you out there that have students in one of these schools, if they're failing their high school courses and acing their college add on class, that's actually a sign that they need to drop the college add-on class. They need to pass high school, right? And so you want to talk about like why do people get proud of being exhausted? I think we're starting it earlier than we used to. With kind of this, yeah, like I'm gonna praise you. Like my kid is so smart. Like I know with my bonus son here this summer, he talked about wanting to be a young Sheldon. I had made the joke on the show, but I that led to a very serious conversation on like, hey, like it's cool if you can do that, but it's more important to pass your classes, right? Like that's you ace that stuff, get those habits down, get that going, and maybe you can be a young Sheldon type. Because I didn't want to tell him that he can't. And then what was great was we had just recorded on how we learn. So I got to share like how we learn. So there's different ways that you can approach it, I think, than just shoving kids in classes, right?
Yeah, and I think I'm going to touch back too on what you talked about in terms of large companies, because more and more in the United States, if you're going to get a job, that job is with a company that is a major corporation. It's great if you can work for a smaller company, and I'm right now I can count myself as a person that does work with a small company. I'm sure the economy will probably wreak havoc with that in the next couple of years or so, but that's a different story for a different day. But if we're talking about big corporations and whatnot, their mindset, especially if they're like a publicly traded company, is always going to be, we have to produce more, we have to make more money. There's never any sort of leeway for, we had a down period, even though most businesses have ups and downs. It's not accepted if you're a major corporation that has a company that has a company that has, that's on the New York Stock Exchange or whatever. If you have one down quarter, people are selling off that stock and you're losing tons of money. And so it makes it imperative for the people that own these corporations to kind of make sure every single minion that works for them is producing and producing and producing, because one down quarter, then, we're talking massive layoffs at that.
Exactly. And that's what stinks is they get up there and they look at it as a number. And they're not understanding like the workplace, like the actual functions of the jobs. And I've worked at so many places where that was the case, and it was just a common frustration of feeling like you're getting demands downward from somebody that does not even understand what you do every day.
Yeah,
So major
and
disconnect.
major disconnect. And I think there are plenty of people, and I've been in that boat myself, who take on more responsibilities than they can particularly handle. I think the good thing about my current, employment situation is that this is probably one of the first times to where I have ever really sat down and thought about what I can provide this company. And, thinking about some of the leadership positions that they have there, it's like I've worked there long enough that if I wanted it, they would gladly give it to me. But I would burn out quite fast, having to, come in early because somebody called out, or, work on the weekends, as well as the, Monday through Friday deal. I would burn out fast. That's not even taking into account the fact that, leadership positions at the place I work at involve talking to, dog parents, and talking to dog parents can be good conversations. But if the dog parent in question was a dog that got involved into a fight and was injured, not quite the most comfortable situation to talk about for me. There are other people that are better suited for that. And I think there are plenty of people in employment or even in school today that are taking on responsibilities that just for them, it just isn't right for them to do.
Right. And there's different people that have different loads, by the way. So you can't necessarily compare yourself to other people. Right? Like, I was talking about being like people being praised for being resilient when really what they're doing was tolerating an unsustainable exchange rate, right? Like too much stuff being thrown at them, not enough reward. But for some people, the exchange rate of where you're working does work for them. So, and if you unfortunately have more people around you where it's working, and you feel like it's not for you, that becomes like possibly an identity issue then, because you probably don't want to feel like you're failing in a place where other people are. But this is where I think it's important, and we are robbing it early when we're telling kids like just do it, just do it, just do it, and not listening to their bodies. is right. Like you see where that primes you for that situation where you're going to stay in a place where you are miserable just because you have other people around that can function in it. Because, yeah, there are people that get a lot of intrinsic value from their job. And guess what? Just because you're like, well, I don't see the intrinsic value you get from cleaning porta johns, but guess what? That person does. Like, there are people, it exists. I know it seems crazy. There are people that actually like that job of going and cleaning the porta johns. Like, and that's fine. They've got their perks to it. But guess what? It's not for everybody. Not every job is for everybody. And I wish that's something that we could really embrace instead of, I need a job, and if I have a job, I should do everything to keep that job. No. I mean, you should, like, responsibility wise, you should like go and show up to work. And like when it comes time to quit, you should put in your notice and you should hand over any material that can help the next person. Like, this is the nice, responsible way to deal with it. But there is that element of recognizing that just like you shouldn't stay in a relationship that isn't a good fit, guess what, guys? We spend 40 hours a week at our jobs. So if that's not a good emotional, mental, or physical fit for you, you are allowed. This is something I like doing back when I did There's Life After Trauma, is reminding people that you are allowed to do certain things. You are allowed to look for a job that is better for you emotionally, mentally, physically, whatever it is. Like, that is fine. Just because people around you in a job are doing fine in that pond, you just need a different ocean, or maybe you need a creek. Like, there's nothing wrong with you as a fish for not thriving in a tiny pond when you're meant to be a salmon swimming upstream. You know what I mean? So there's that element too. And I think, unfortunately, with what we're doing with education and kids and this really high demand, is we're teaching them to ignore that and to not make pivots and to just like mash through and push the I believe button. Because there's some practices at these schools that unfortunately do encourage that. But that's a little bit of a digression slash still related. But I think we could use to teach early on to identify when overwhelm starts to happen so that we could potentially avoid burnout. Because I think the anxiety epidemic in our children very well could be more related to burnout than we potentially want to say. Because then that makes it an adult's fault, right? Like, oh, they're anxious, they're getting holds of phones and they're getting these things. And I was like, well, I mean, there's that too, but then there's also this weird pressure that we've started doing on their schooling of over exceeding instead of just having support to schedule better and just do better in school, like in general.
Agreed. Agreed. And it seems too like we've almost turned exhaustion into a status symbol. You got people that say,
Right.
yeah, I'm so busy. I only slept 4 hours. I haven't had a vacation in 3 years. And instead of hearing those statements and thinking, oh no, you need help, sometimes we hear them as evidence that somebody is successful. It's bizarre. Imagine bragging about never changing the oil in your car. Yeah, she's got 180,000 miles and I've never checked anything. That's not impressive. That's a future roadside emergency. Now, one of the reasons burnout is so difficult is that exhaustion doesn't only affect our energy, it affects our ability to make decisions. That's where decision fatigue comes into the conversation. Every day we're making decisions, big ones, small ones, important ones, ridiculous ones. What should I eat? What should I wear? Should I answer this email? Should I call somebody back? What needs to happen first? Do I have enough time? What do I do about this problem? And then there's the really important question. Why is every streaming service offering me 47,000 choices and somehow I can't find anything to watch? Sometimes the brain doesn't want another discussion. It wants somebody to make the decision. Now, what does decision fatigue look like in everyday life?
So one thing I did want to say really quick, because you'd said something and it just brought me to another ism in our home, was the whole busyness badge. And there is a saying that I have and that I have shared, that if you say you are too busy for something, try phrasing it that that is not a priority for you. And if that does not feel good, it sounds like you need to reprioritize some things in your life. And I like pointing that out to people because sometimes it can be a little bit upsetting to hear it that way, but it's true. It is super, super true that sometimes, like, being too busy for your mental health, like, you do need to prioritize that, though. Because if that's not a priority for you, that is going to affect a lot of things in your life, and decision fatigue being one of them. And the reason that I am bringing this up along with decision fatigue is we've even talked about, like, you listed a bunch of decisions, but that's not even talking about how, like, most people have become too busy to clean their homes, for example. And what we've also learned is part of that adds to your cognitive load and therefore has a high effect on decision fatigue is even looking past the mess that you've left on top of something and choosing to leave it there because part of your brain knows it doesn't belong there. Back to your question though about what does decision fatigue look like in everyday life? Like, I want to avoid making it look as a simple finite mental energy tank, right? Like, we don't really work like our brain isn't a computer. We don't have like an energy tank that cleanly like depletes, right? But the research on cognitive fatigue, ego depletion, and decision fatigue is a lot more complicated than the popular version, right? Cognitive resources are depleted is fine as conversational shorthand, right? But we can't imply a literal fixed quantity of mental energy that gets emptied. That doesn't actually exist. So, decision fatigue in everyday life is kind of what you just talked about. It's all of those little things, and we don't get to know how big our reserve tank is. And I think that's why it is incredibly smart to make things as easy for you as possible because it goes back to our adage lately is that we don't live in a bubble. There's a lot of things that influence our stress that are outside of our control. So it does seem to have a good lean in that it would be worth it for us to find some things that are under our control so that we can reduce overall decision fatigue. And maybe that is, hey, you know what? I keep the Clorox bleach wipes next to the toilet, and when I have my morning piss, I'm just gonna wipe it down really quick. Because something that I learned working in service industry is if you give a little bit of attention to your toilet and you're the only one using it, you effectively never have to do a deep clean on your toilet. Like, right? Because if you think about, if you ever worked for any place that has like the bathroom duties, you're going in there 2, 3 times a day to wipe down toilets that have been used by dozens of customers. So, like, if you can hit that sucker like once a day as part of your routine, guess what? That's actually something that makes your brain a little bit happier in the background. And it's those silly little micro things, like having habits around brushing your teeth, because brushing your teeth should be a priority. That's actually linked to a lot of gut biome health and overall body wellness. Like, these matter way more than we ever realized, right? There's actually a current argument that there should not be separate dental insurance. It is all body health. Like, it's so weird that that got separated for some reason as if it was a luxury, right?
America, yeah.
America. So yeah, so I think that's what decision fatigue looks like is that surprising lack of practice we've had around the little things that probably helped a lot more than we realize because we look at our culture as a whole and how our mental health has become more of a highlight in recent years of what's going on with our anxiety. And a lot of this we've looped into the relationship to the multi-generational home and moving towards the nuclear family. And when you think about it, it makes sense still that that would have an effect because you used to have more hands on deck to clean up after themselves. Somebody else could see the spill on the counter and wipe it up, right? Like, there was a lot more teamwork when you had your multi-generational home than now with the nuclear family, and a lot of it ends up landing on 1 or 2 people. So I think that's the way it looks in everyday life, is that we've just had so many little things stacked on top of other bigger things, like little things that used to be taken care of in a way naturally in the home, on top of bigger concepts like the social media stream and the real addiction that it is to checking that scroll all the time. And everything you pass by. We even talked about this on the social media episode that every little reel you choose not to watch that your brain acknowledges for a second, that all adds. So what we've done is we've taken away some systems that seem to really help keep our life healthier, right? Like the cleaning habits and the stuff like that, because you've got more hands on deck, it's a little bit easier to do. And we've taken that away. And then we've also added in this surprising stressor that is masked as being social. So our brain wants it because we're social creatures, but it actually might be making the decision fatigue and the cognitive load like severely imbalanced. So, yeah, it is all about that not living in a bubble. And we've taken away some certain supports we used to have. And dadgummit, that just made life baseline more stressful anyway.
Yeah, because whether you utilize checklists during your everyday life or not, there is a mental checklist you go through for every single thing that you do. And basically, if you are prioritizing something like work or school over some of the other things that, you have to deal with, like, keeping your apartment clean. And, clean is a relative term for some people. Some people can tolerate a little clutter. Some people need to have the white glove test at all times. But if you find yourself constantly dismissing, hey, I'll take care of the dishes later, I'll take care of the dishes later, suddenly you get to a point by the end of the week to where you've used every single dish, and then doing the dishes becomes a much bigger project. Or simply cleaning the clutter that somebody has. If somebody says, I'll do it later because I got to do this, that suddenly becomes a much bigger deal. And for some people could even go into like hoarding type of unintentional hoarding type of circumstances, just because they're utilizing their brain functions to focus on something else. Yeah.
It's interesting how it presents when there's imbalances. I'll say that because yes, hoarding is something that can kind of start being a bit of a thing that can maybe potentially develop because you have so much stuff around you and
Yeah.
you're
Oh, yeah.
just trying to find a simple way to deal with it, and organizing it slightly differently, which I'm putting in quotes because that's something that sometimes hoarders will justify, is it just needs to be organized differently, right? um, Feels easier than getting rid of it. And that goes back to that simplicity bias. It's probably at play way more often than we want it to be in our little brains.
Indeed. Now, this is one reason routines can actually be helpful. If you know what you're eating for breakfast, what time you're going to exercise, when you're going to answer emails, you've removed some decisions from your day. You're not making yourself less spontaneous, you're saving some mental bandwidth. Now, here's something I think people experiencing burnout often noticed. Tasks that normally feel easy suddenly feel enormous. Answering an email becomes a project. Making a phone call becomes a project. Cleaning the kitchen becomes a project. Choosing what to eat becomes a project. And then you look at yourself and think, what's wrong with me? Maybe nothing is wrong with you. Maybe your cognitive resources are just simply depleted. Do you think people are more likely to criticize themselves when they're burned out than they are to recognize the exhaustion themselves?
Yes. I mean, this goes back to kind of like what we started the episode with like almost like the pride and busyness and everything, and that pride and overachieving, and the overall kind of message that we do kind of have of, if you can't complete the things you want to do that you say you want to do, then there's something wrong with you. It's that pull yourself up by your bootstrap stuff, right? Like, it is all on you. This is a matter of you not having enough willpower for the things that you want to do. And I think that's why we go back to just like being kind of hard on ourselves, because we have a severe misunderstanding of where motivation comes from and how that works. And particular to what we're talking about for this section, how important recovery, like truly recovering from having stress on your body, like that there's a difference between resting and recovering effectively. And if you don't understand that, you're not actually fully recovering, and then you're wondering why you don't have energy for anything. It's almost like you're going on a long trip, and rest is water, recovery is gasoline. And if you're putting water in your gas tank, you're not going to get much further, if any further at all, because that's not what you actually need.
Agreed. Agreed. And I think too, it does kind of boil down, like, speaking of my burnout when it came to Apple, I didn't want to recognize the exhaustion because of that place, because of the fact that it held my that it kept paying me, um, and I just kept on thinking of, what if I tried this? What if I tried this? Because initially I was one of their technicians that worked on like their mobile devices and everything like that, and I got to the point where I had to say, I don't want to do this. Can I go into sales? And then I went into sales and then discovered I didn't want to do that either. But the paycheck, the paycheck, the paycheck, instead of getting to the point to where I should have realized much quicker that, hey, maybe this place just isn't for me, and that is okay. Maybe I should go out and find something that does speak to me a little better than what this particular job has to offer. People don't necessarily want to have that conversation, whether it be like let's say somebody in school, for instance, if they're studying to be an engineer for or whatever, and they're constantly finding that they're just not passing the classes, but they want to be an engineer, and yet they're not having the discussion with themselves that maybe this goal of mine is not achievable for me, which
Right. And
some.
there's ways to pivot that too, right? But then again, if you're feeling depleted, you're not going to have the cognitive load and openness for problem solving, right? Like we learned this before too. But right, like there's those signs. And then that's awesome because then you can go into that inventory, right? Of like, well, what about engineering appeals to me? So what can I then do? But we do have a lot of narrative in American culture that you can do anything. You just have to work hard enough or find the secret learning model. Are you a visual learner, Tim, or are you an auditory learner? Like, remember, we just covered how some of that kind of puts the fault on the student for not learning something as if there's some magic model to your brain that you're just supposed to like, yep, that's your education model. And if you use that, you will learn everything swimmingly.
And you did just make this point here too, that recovery is not the same thing as rest. This might be the most important distinction of today's episode. Rest and recovery aren't necessarily the same thing. Rest can mean stopping an activity. Recovery is storing your ability to function. You can spend an entire Saturday sitting on a couch and still feel terrible Monday morning, but maybe your body rested, but your brain never recovered. Now, what do you think people misunderstand about recovery?
So I think there's an important distinction to make. And I'm glad that we're having this conversation because psychologists have broken down like rest and recovery into being their own completely different experiences. One is psychological detachment, right? Like getting your brain out of work mode. And I think a lot of people can relate to that, right? That you need that disconnect. It was actually one of the talking points that was a fair criticism of working from home after the pandemic was that people had a hard time like detaching, right? So we kind of learned how important that was as a culture. But the other one is relaxation, or another one I should say is relaxation. But there are two others I find really interesting because again, this is not just as simple as rest and recovery. There's whole phases to this. But there's mastery and control, which is part of it. And mastery means doing something that gives you a sense of competence outside the thing that's exhausting you. So it can't be the same thing. Control means having some say over what you do with your own time. So, recovery isn't necessarily lying on a couch. Sometimes it's doing something that reminds your brain, I am a person who gets to choose things, and I'm capable of things that have nothing to do with the demands currently draining me. And I think this is why I appreciate crocheting so much. It is not a high cost hobby to get into. It is actually like shown to be like meditative because you're relaxing and you're just kind of looking at what's in front of you. Actually, there's some interesting stuff with learning and recall, as we learned like last week how we learn, right? Like how our brain like functions neurologically. Um, so yeah, like I think people get really disappointed because they go home and they sit on their weekend and then they go back and Monday they're still exhausted. And I think that's because they really are confusing resting, like laying down, with recovery. And they're just simply not the same things. Right. So a lot of where some of this like separate recovery experience comes from is some research by Sabine Sonntag and Charlotte Fritz, and they developed the recovery experience questionnaire. And this is around psychological detachment, relaxation, mastery, and control. So they went through all of these little, like they said, there's more than just like two steps. There's more than just rest and recover. There's all of these little things in between that seem to need to happen. And their research shows these are related but separate recovery experiences connected to stress and well being. Later research has examined recovery experience in relation to burnout, including interventions to improve psychological detachment from work. So, all of that to say, it's not just as easy as going home and doing your weekend routine. Hell, if you're a parent, that actually might be exacerbating the problem because that's taking away your control, that you don't feel like you have autonomy. And we've learned about this with happiness when we talked about, financial freedom, right? It's more about feeling in control than having all of the supply of money or all of the means. Like that autonomy experience for humans is so valid and huge for mental health and just life happiness. That if you are running on a routine mode, you might not realize that your weekends are not restful, especially if you have kids and you feel like you're doing a lot of your weekend activity is out of obligation, right? Now, the same can go if you are a parent and you have a child in the education system. You might want to watch how much of their free time is obligatory to you and your schedule, because that could then be affecting them. So, I guess I'm saying, like, of course, as always, our experience and our cultural wellness gets better when we understand that not a single one of us is a special snowflake that is the only one experiencing this. Most things are experienced by everybody. Burnout is experienced by students and workers alike. And so, therefore, we do influence each other's experiences in these, right? We have influence over our child and their whole world. And therefore, are they actually resting and doing all the steps for recovery? We have the ability to look at ourselves and realize that it matters that we're doing these things, and that like, yeah, it does matter to a point to have your own hobbies and stuff that you can disconnect and have control over then, right? Because it is going to help you with that emotional regulation so that you can then go and tackle the things that you do have to do that you don't have control over. It's almost like your brain needs the I've got control. And given that I'm currently raising a 3-year-old that is throwing his autonomy in my face right now, you can kind of see like where that is kind of on the kid level. It's shown as being important then, right? Because what are they other than little versions of us kind of learning what's important live in front of our faces? And so, yeah, nobody escapes the tantrum phase. And a lot of it is because they're learning that autonomy importance. They feel it. They've had a lot of stuff that is given to them, done for them. So it is a very human need to be able to control and do things on your own and have the autonomy. And I think children are just the hyperbolic example of that in the learning phase, but it definitely never got less important as you got older. The tantrum phase is you learning just how important that is. And that is why every single one of us had the tantrum phase as kids. It is that important for our regulation to have autonomy and control and a sense of just self and mastery.
Indeed, indeed, because when it comes to recovery or relaxation or stuff like that, if your job is physically demanding, sleep might be incredibly important. If your job is emotionally demanding, you might need social connection. If you're constantly making decisions, you might need periods where nobody needs anything from you. If you're socially overloaded, being alone might actually feel restorative. Recovery isn't necessarily doing nothing. It's doing what restores the resources you've been spending. And this is where I have to bring up Spider Man. Oh,
Before you
unless you
bring
had
up
something to say.
Spider-Man, I'm
All
so
right.
sorry. I'm going to interject one thought because I don't want to lose this before we go. I think a really good takeaway from this section from anybody out there is don't think about what you quote unquote need when you're feeling stressed and you're hitting your weekend. I think the question you need to ask yourself is what's something you do that actually makes you feel like yourself again, rather than simply something that occupies your time? Because that's even falling into the trap of a lot of people sit and choose to watch shows and binge, but that's not necessarily doing the same thing. That actually might fall more under rest than recovery, and a lot of us seem to use that for recovery right now. So sorry, future Tim, if you have to splice that in funny for some editing, but I thought it was a very worthy thought to throw in at this section. Of a good takeaway is, don't just give up and say, well, I guess I'm just resting. Like, you can ask yourself some active questions on how you can effectively recover, like how you can actually add in mastery and control, because we seem to be really good at detachment and relaxation. So if you can add in mastery and control, you might find your Mondays or whatever day of the week you go back to work to be functionally better for you.
Yeah, I don't think future Tim will have to splice anything there.
Okay, good.
Yeah. Well, back to Spider-Man, because Peter Parker might be one of the greatest fictional examples of someone who desperately needs a vacation and absolutely refuses to take one. Peter's life is basically, I'm exhausted, I'm overwhelmed, people need me, I can't let them down, I'll just keep going. And then eventually, Spider-Man is hanging upside down from a building, wondering why everything hurts. Peter Parker has superhero burnout. Now, do you think one reason Spider Man is such a relatable character is that his superpower isn't actually the fantasy?
I think there's another reason the Spider-Man thing hits so hard. And it's sometimes responsibility isn't just something we do. It becomes part of who we believe we are, right? Because that even goes into Spider-Man as the protector, right? He obviously has a lot of identity around this. And plus, like, you got to remember, he's a kid. He is a kid in high school. And that is something that I think often gets forgotten with Spider-Man. And that's why I think this is actually an interesting relation to more of what kids are going through now than potentially what they did back when Spider-Man was first like brought up, right? But if I've built my identity around being the person who handles things, resting doesn't just feel inconvenient for me. It can feel like I'm failing at being myself. So, yeah, Spider-Man might need a rest, but if he takes that rest, that's like not doing his thing, right? And so it almost becomes of an imbalance of that control and mastery. But that's a much harder problem because now you're not negotiating with a to-do list. You're negotiating with your own identity. And this even goes back to we've almost built a pride in busyness, right? So that's exacerbating this. But identity centrality research looks at how important particular roles or identities are to a person's sense of self. So this is like kind of that dive into the identity portion. Not, I know we talked a lot about identity threat, but this is more understanding how we build identity. And highly central identities become especially consequential when threatened or conflicted. And that should sound familiar from our conversations. Like this is that turnover to the identity threat, right? This overlaps with overcommitment research and occupational stress, though, because excessive striving plus a strong need for approval equals this pot of shitty soup that we keep trying to eat and convince ourselves that we like. Because longitudinal work suggests overcommitment can shift with the environment, so it shouldn't be treated as a flexible personality trait, right? Like you can overcommit for like short periods of time. This is the same thing, like kind of talking about how our brain is dumb and how it reacts to stress. Like we can react to these stressors short term. Actually, our brains and our bodies are really great at dealing with a short term burst of stress, right? But it's not great at doing it, making it part of the lifestyle, like we said earlier. Like it's not good at overcommitting and overexerting as a lifestyle. It's good at, oh shit, that tiger's coming. I better get my cortisol up and my adrenaline and everything and get the fuck going. Like it's really good at that, but it's not good at get the fuck going for years. Right? So sometimes the hardest thing to put down isn't the actual workload, it's the identity you built around being the person who carries it. Because as somebody who considered themselves a pretty up and coming, like I was going up, I was moving into CSM work and I was getting promoted, I definitely can say factually that I fell into that trap of identifying as a good worker and identifying as a hard worker. And even to the tune of I used to give myself permission to judge these lesser humans. You know, how dare you be 15 minutes late on our stupid, unimportant occurrence system that I now realize is just a garbage way to turn over people. But anyway, I digress. But right, like we get that built into us where we get praised for certain things. And it goes back to, I do think it very innocently starts back at school, where we get basically praised for being the overachiever. If you're just doing your classes, you're just doing enough to get by. You know what I mean? So I can't say for sure what groomed that in me, but I know for a fact I had it. And I know that's what led to the burnout of me eventually quitting working in big tech, because at that point it had been all of them are pretty much getting bought up. Like almost none of them are small tech companies anymore. So I feel like it's kind of ruined the atmosphere. But, being able to recognize that was good though. Like that was definitely a life improvement for me. That I went, "Oh, no, I'm having anxiety attacks. I need to quit this job."
Yeah, and kind of tying it back to Spider-Man. I mean, the new Spider-Man movie does kind of tie into all of this. I'm not going to go into spoilers because I know at some point the baby Reverend will want to see that movie. Probably not best for a theater experience. I'll put it that way. But
No, we're going to wait for Bluey and hope there's a daytime quiet showing.
yeah, Spider-Man Bluey or something like that. But yeah, the big point of the new film is that he does take all this responsibility upon himself. He shuns everybody away, but then he experiences burnout in weird ways in the movie. I'll just put it that way. But really, really good example too of that. And I think I think this is where Spider-Man becomes surprisingly useful for this conversation because Peter Parker's problem isn't that he doesn't care. He cares too much. He's constantly balancing responsibility, work, relationships, and that's one critique I have about Spider-Man. They present him as a nerd, but he gets Mary Jane Watson and Gwen Stacy. That son of a bitch. Anyway,
Well, now back when it was written, that was less realistic. But nowadays, I think it's a little bit more realistic. I will say
yeah.
that. Like, I remember whenever I was a kid, we felt that was a little bit outside of the realm of possibility that the nerd would get the hot chicks. But nowadays, that seems to have turned, by the way.
Yeah, it didn't turn for me, damn it. No, I'm kidding.
Very Revenge of the Nerds.
Yeah. Anyway, relationships, school, money, family, and saving New York from whatever lunatic happens to be throwing a tank through a building that week. And eventually, something has to give. Sometimes the problem isn't that you don't care enough. Sometimes you care about too many things without giving yourself enough time to recover. And that brings us to another kind of exhaustion, compassion fatigue. This is especially interesting for people who spend their lives helping others, caregivers, teachers, healthcare workers, social workers, first responders, animal care workers, therapists, parents. Anyone whose job or life requires them to continually respond to other people's needs. You can genuinely care about people and still become emotionally exhausted from caring. Now, do you think people sometimes feel guilty admitting that they're tired of helping because they think, if I really cared, I wouldn't be tired?
The parent of a 3-year-old. Yes. Um, no, I mean, it's a very real thing, right? Through my lens, I definitely feel this in that realm of parenthood. So it definitely makes sense that it would happen in other realms as well. Like, for example, in psychology and education, like when people feel guilty admitting they're tired of helping, oh, absolutely. Especially if you went into the career path of a teacher. And then you get in there, and then there's all this reality of it's not just you getting to teach students, it's you're having to do these certain things and all of this and all of that. And over time, like teaching, you used to have a lot more control over how you taught. And now, because of like Common Core and things like that, you're expected to teach kids 20 different ways of doing things, and the child is now expected to figure out the best way for them to do math. And it used to be more encouraged that as a teacher, you were taught how to teach kids and you had more control over, oh, little Johnny over here needs to use the block method to conceptualize the math. And meanwhile, little Susie Q over here needs the whatever sliding thingy. I don't know. Like I tried to do like the Duolingo math recently. And I'm like, why am I sliding a bar to figure out the difference between 5 and 7? So there's just some interesting stuff that I don't understand with Common Core. But I do understand that they do need to teach all of it. And it's taken away a lot of that. And when you've got those careers, like, right, like, especially because in America, we do seem to identify quite a lot with a career choice, like when you choose a career. And when you start doing that, like anything done out of obligation is going to breed resentment. So if your value is in the money and not the intrinsic value of finding actual internal worth of doing your job, that's going to get harder over time. But if you actually did have that intrinsic value of like, I'm going to teach and I'm gonna help these kids learn and do all these good things and help our culture out. And then instead you are just constantly beat down with like, all of the rigmarole and all of the politics around it and all of the this and that and the other. And then don't get me started on now there's training around school shootings. Like, I could see where that would really pull the rug out from under your intrinsic value for doing this career. And I could see where you would maybe even feel a bit guilty about that. So, I mean, I do want to make sure, like, while we're talking about this particular like compassion fatigue topic here, I want to make sure that we know we put out that there's a small distinction around the phrase compassion fatigue, because people sometimes use it as if it's a synonym for burnout, and it's not quite that clean. Researchers have used it to describe several overlapping things, including burnout and secondary traumas, and secondary traumatic stress, which is specifically about the effects of indirect exposure to other people's trauma. So it's got another application other than necessarily like education and burnout and things like that. But a caregiver can become exhausted because of workload or from repeatedly witnessing suffering, or both at once. And that's where some of that compassion fatigue came from as well. So not I didn't want to pull it completely out of context of what it was studying, but just understanding it's not irrelevant to the conversation, but it is important to understand what they were looking at. And the other important thing about it is feeling depleted by caring doesn't mean the caring wasn't genuine. I guess is the overall really good finding that we should kind of anchor to, of that, of yes, it wasn't necessarily talking about burnout and compassion fatigue in the essence of like how it applies to work or how it necessarily applies to education. They were talking about it as a caretaker for somebody dealing with like stress or trauma, or I believe this was also like long term, like a physical ailment, like if they were terminally ill. Um, like I said, it's been a little second since I looked into this last week, so I just remember like it was not about like work, and I wanted to make sure we put the context into that term. But the literature has used compassion fatigue inconsistently, and systematic reviews note overlap with both burnout and secondary traumatic stress. And research also shows compassion satisfaction and secondary traumatic stress can coexist. So what's funny is you can still be experiencing this kind of negative feeling around helping somebody, but still kind of feel good about helping them. It's an interesting conundrum. But yeah, somebody can find real meaning in helping people while also experiencing an emotional cost from that work.
Indeed, because compassion fatigue doesn't necessarily mean you stop caring. Sometimes it just means you've been caring without enough recovery. Now, there's another version of this I think people experience as well, and that's being the person everybody relies on. You're the dependable one, the responsible one, the person who always answers the phone, the person who remembers everybody's birthdays, the person who fixes the problem, the person who says, I've got this. Eventually, people stop asking whether you have it. They just assume you do. Now, have you seen someone become so identified with being the strong one that they couldn't admit that they needed help?
Yes. And I go back to, I think this is what we're accidentally teaching our kids, especially in these high performing schools. Um, and I do think like I'm trying not to take it back to parenting, but it's just so hard not to, because I go back to that invisible list of all the things you end up having to do. And that's where I can relate very strongly. Like, yes, sometimes I do feel like I'm being quote unquote the strong one. And that kind of will hurt after a time, right? Like it almost goes back to almost that, what was that term we literally just used? Compassion fatigue. It kind of almost goes into that in a sense, but I think because of what we just learned about compassion fatigue, burnout is the more accurate term. I think my understanding after we just talked it out and, like I said, researching it last week, I think this is the more accurate term is burnout for this, for being like the strong one. But right, but there is something else that happens when you're the person everyone relies on, and that's you can start getting reinforcement for never needing anything. Right? Like, it's not because the strong one isn't just the one that's always helping, right? People also kind of trust the strong one to not be very demanding. People trust you because you handle things and you handle more things. And eventually, being needed becomes evidence that you're doing your job as a person correctly. And that is a very dangerous feedback loop because asking for help can suddenly feel like violating the role everybody, including you now, has come to expect from you. And so that's where it can really hurt, right? Like we know how bad it is when you can't ask for help, right? And this connects back to that overcommitment research that we were just talking about a little while up there, that excessive striving plus the strong need for approval associated with greater occupational strain, right? And identity research alongside of that, like when a role becomes highly central to self concept, stepping outside it feels psychologically consequential, if not physically dangerous. Going back to brain being dumb, right? So longitudinal research suggests that overcommitment can change with the environment, and it goes back to that one, right? Like it's fine for the short term. It can change for the environment in the moment, but it can't start turning into a personality trait for you. Like you can't keep overcommitting to being the strong one. You can't keep overcommitting to being the one that's constantly learning all of the things. Like you can't do it all the time. However, if you need to do it for a short stint of time because, say, you decided to go back to school while you're working and you're overcommitting for handfuls of months at a time, but what's nice is there's a light at the end of the tunnel for that, right? Like you will have an end to your schooling. So as long as you have that ability to close those loops, it's not a bad thing to overcommit in spurts. It's not a bad thing to overexert in spurts. Like actually there seems to be a decent argument that our bodies are built for that. But the issue becomes when it doesn't stop. When you never actually recover, when you never actually quit the overexertion mode, right? And that just is going to deplete your cognitive load, keep you at a baseline of stress where you don't even have much of a tank to fill. I know we just said it's not a physical tank, but it is kind of fun to talk about it that way. But right, like you're starting off with a lot of watery gas in your tank because you're not giving it gasoline, you're giving it water. You're not giving it what it needs. You're only doing the overcommitment.
Which could lead to chronic burnout, and burnout becomes particularly dangerous when it stops being an episode and becomes your identity. You stop saying, I'm having a rough month, and start saying, this is just who I am. I'm always exhausted. I'm just not motivated anymore. I don't enjoy anything. That's a very different situation. Now, at what point do you think someone should stop trying to simply manage burnout and start asking whether something fundamental in their life needs to change?
Man, I think that is a really good question that displays a very common psychological trap in our culture. When a temporary state gets repeated long enough, we can start turning it into an identity statement, right? Because this goes back to you don't always pick being the strong one, like what we just talked about. Sometimes that gets implied on you enough that it therefore gets normalized in your little world that you just accept that role, right? So I'm exhausted also can become that internal like dialogue where you're convincing yourself that you just are an exhausted person. I'm struggling right now can become I'm just bad at this, right? Because that's almost like the other end of the just statements that I talked about earlier, that when you're saying it to somebody else, it's probably coming from a place of privilege. But when you're saying it about yourself, I'm just bad at this. I'm just an exhausted person. Like you can almost feel the challenge of that's giving up on something, that you're justing it, right? And once we make that shift, we're not describing an experience anymore, right? We're describing ourselves. We're starting to turn it into that narrative. And we've talked about like social narrative, right? And that goes right back to you didn't choose to be the strong one. The social narrative normalized that title for you, and now you got it. So you can do that internally, right? Like you can fake it until you make it, but the problem is that works for negative self-talk too. And so that's much harder to change at that point as well, because it's become an internal thing. Because now changing the behavior is changing who you are, because it's not an experience anymore, it's who you are. And identity research distinguishes between having an experience and incorporating a role or state into the broader self concept. The more central an identity becomes, the more psychologically consequential the threats to it can be. right? Like that's part of that identity threat curve. And a useful lens for why changing a burnout pattern can feel threatening even when someone recognizes it's hurting them, right? Because we like predictability more than we like change. So unfortunately, the thing is you have to like talk to your animal brain and try to get it on a logic path to get away from the emotion of being tied to the identity. Like that even goes to I'm a busy person. I'm just a yeller. I'm this. Like you hear it all the time in people, right? Like I'm just too busy to clean. I'm just too busy to blah, blah, blah. Like the busy one, I think, is the thing that gets me the most because I hear it the most with people. Because obviously, guys, I'm a nerd. So my friend conversations don't go too far, like not like this. Like me and my bestie Trey and I have been going back and forth a lot over like mental health stuff. And I taught her a bunch about cortisol and how it's actually like kind of good for us. Like but these are the kind of friends that you should try to groom in your life because they're going to give you the useful information. They might even be more able to recognize burnout in you and not accidentally go for, oh, I'm encouraging you to do this thing that you say you love. When really sometimes the action of the friend would be to encourage you that maybe you need to look at something to change in your life. Right. And so because I have these conversations a lot, I do get the I'm just blank statements. And it almost makes me think of like how that saying that's misappropriated or maybe never even said by Marilyn Monroe, that we've almost taken it to a toxic level of if you can't accept me at my worst, you don't deserve me at my best. And it's given people this very convenient out for doing hard work. So it's almost like they took this and yeah, I there's a lot of people who say that she maybe never even said that, but what it's kind of done is this quote has just kind of taken off and given a lot of people permission to say, well, the problem isn't with me. The problem is that you can't accept me and all of my variability. But the problem with that is when you're not working on those kind of negative parts of yourself, like you're robbing yourself of that shadow integration work, right? And that work of kind of becoming a better person. Like it might feel good to say, I'm not going to work on things, but that's not actually like the best thing for you. So, I mean, all of that just to say, when you get really burnt out, like when you are, like, I think the moment you start experiencing burnout, you need to ask better questions of yourself. And even goes to how you're spending your rest time, right? Like asking that question, like I said earlier, what makes you feel like you again? What is an activity that gives you control and that you have mastery over or can gain mastery? This can even work over to learning something new, I believe. Like picking up a hobby or something like that, that you can take that control back and that you need to change what's going on in your life. Like, for example, if you can reframe cooking to being a hobby for you, oh man, that's winner, winner, chicken dinner, but not literally if you're vegan. Because that can be a craft that you then, guess what, don't have to clean up and find a place for later because it's going to be in your tummy feeling yummy. And you're also like working at your health stuff. So some of it can even be trying to reframe to find joy in things that you know are good for you, that you're not actually like ticking those boxes. So I think that kind of answers that question, right? Like it's like part of managing burnout needs to stop looking at it as managing burnout, right? Like maybe that's the problem almost with that mentality is that when you realize you're managing burnout, you need to start switching over to how to recover from your burnout and stop just managing it. Right? It's like, sure, you can manage walking different with that huge corn on your foot, or you can go and get what needs to happen with it so you can start recovering from it and walking normally and wearing normal shoes again, right? Like there's ways to look at this that can hopefully encourage you to get on the other side of all of that resistance because parts of our brains just simply don't like change. And I think we need to embrace that and find a way to challenge that in a healthy way that is somehow different than forcing it and causing resentment, right? And this is all stuff that only you can do in your own mind. And you might have a hard time doing it with everything, to be totally real. But that doesn't mean that you shouldn't try, right? Don't get into the, well, I'm just a messy person, right? I'm just stressed. I just have anxiety. See, that's like, I feel like where we've leaned into on the overcorrection of psychology speak that we've talked about in the past. Of like, no, it's great that we've embraced these things. It's wonderful that we've embraced that people can have an anxiety disorder. But I think the problem becomes when that gives people permission to then identify as a person who has anxiety, and therefore it's scarier to change that element later.
And I think that brings us to the question we started with. Why can't we simply push through exhaustion? I think the answer is because exhaustion isn't always a motivational problem. Sometimes it's information. Your body is telling you the demands are exceeding the resources available to meet them. And if we continually ignore that signal, the signal doesn't necessarily disappear. Sometimes it gets louder. I want to end with the thesis we started with. Burnout isn't weakness. It's a signal that our recovery systems have fallen behind our demands. That doesn't mean every feeling of exhaustion means you're burned out. It doesn't mean we should quit every difficult job. It doesn't mean we should avoid responsibility. And it definitely doesn't mean that we should never push through discomfort. Sometimes we have to. But if pushing through becomes the only strategy we have, eventually we're going to run out of the road. Now, if somebody listening right now recognizes themselves in this conversation, what's the first thing you'd want them to consider?
That there's actually an elegant biological principle underneath the idea of recovery falling behind demand, right? That it is not. I love it when it's biological or neurological, by the way, because when I say that, I am telling you it is not a willpower thing, guys. This is not a you problem. This is understanding like that there are mechanisms in our brain and our body that do make this harder. Like you're not crazy. And that also, when we're thinking of stress, like stress itself isn't the enemy. And I know we kind of covered this, right? Like your stress systems exist because they have been incredibly useful, especially in our evolution and surviving as a species, right? They mobilize your energy, they increase vigilance, they redirect physical and emotional and mental resources to help you respond to challenges. And the problem isn't having a stress response. As already said, the problem is asking an adaptive system to keep adapting indefinitely without enough opportunity to return towards a baseline. And that's where that allostatic load becomes useful again. But that we talked about earlier in the episode, your body is remarkably good at meeting emergencies. We're great at that. Like I said, that's what's helped us survive as humans. It's much less interested in making emergencies your personal, like, permanent lifestyle, though. Like, it doesn't like that. And so, a lot of these symptoms, if you want to think of it that way, burnout is really a symptom of saying, this is too much. We either need to move to a new cave or do something because we're getting attacked by lions every week and this needs to quit. Like it's a physical reaction to your body saying stop this. It is no different than having a physical reaction to being stung by an insect. It is not a lack of anything in you that it feels difficult. Because yeah, for that whole allostatic load framework, adaptation versus the cumulative cost of that repeated adaptation, that continually having to adapt constantly because life is stressful and there's always a new thing. So it's worth also naming job demands resource model here, which is another thing that came up whenever I was looking into allostatic load research and like people that kind of like piggybacked off of that. But essentially what the jobs demands resources model shows is that excessive demands contribute to exhaustion, while insufficient resources contribute to disengagement. So burnout risk depends on both demands and resources, which totally ties into a lot of the concepts that we brought up earlier, right? It even almost how tech companies dangled a carrot and then big corporations took it away and went, but still run, bunny, run. So And so I guess like that's kind of what's important to take in is I think it's important to understand, like, first of all, like, yes, you do need control over stuff, but I think it is fundamentally important to understand and accept the things that we do not have control over. And there's ancient wisdom behind that too, but basically the human body is incredibly good at surviving emergencies, but it was never designed to make emergency mode its permanent address. And when it starts feeling like you've moved in, it is going to act out, right? Like, it's just how that has always worked. And it's really funny because it brings me back, how I like to bring up like ancient knowledge. And granted, this isn't in the Bible, but it is something that got shared a lot along my raising, and that is something called the serenity prayer. And so if you take anything, like, take this one little snippet, this is a good one. And it was basically, it's God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. And think of the Christian community all you want. I still think that is a really, really solid piece of advice to take in there. Right. And I know there's more to it, but that little snippet I think is completely relevant to our conversation today, because I think we all need to learn the wisdom part is what we're missing, is how do we tell the difference between the things that we cannot change and the things that we simply need to find a way to change. And that's the piece to work on for everybody.
Agreed. And for me, I think the biggest takeaway is that recovery needs to be treated as part of productivity, not the opposite of productivity. Because if you're constantly spending energy and never replenishing it, eventually the math stops working. You can't withdraw from the account forever. At some point, the bank says no. And unlike my bank account, my brain doesn't even send me a polite email first. Maybe the healthier question isn't how much more can I handle? Maybe it's what do I need in order to keep handling life well? Those are very different questions. And I think the second one is a much healthier place to start and end our conversation.
Ta-da!
Look at
So,
that segue.
yeah, to having the courage, to finding the things to change so that you can handle life gooder.
Yes, well, I think that was a wonderful talk here. But before we wrap things up, this episode, when it drops, should be on August 24th. And that is one day past the 9-year anniversary of Friends Talking Nerdy's debut.
Oh, 9 years. We have to think about something special to do for our decade. But we are we are talking about getting swag going soon, I think. Just because summer's over, my bonus son went back to Portland. So I have a little bit more time in my background around my job and a pending move coming up, but that'll probably be news more to share at a later date.
Yeah, no spoilers here. But
Spoilers.
yeah, I never. It's like when we first started this, I hoped that it would go on and on and on. But the fact that we're at the 9-year mark and going, to me, it's like there aren't many podcasts that get to this point. There just aren't.
Yeah. I mean, it does go to prove that we sure can talk about some things.
Indeed, indeed. And yeah, the show has definitely changed in a lot of ways since we first started here. And as always, folks, keep in mind, our philosophy has always been we try to put out the best possible episode we can on the day that we release it. With that being said, I know there are some episodes in the archives that I wish I can go back and be like, delete, delete, delete.
Exactly.
just because I wouldn't, release them the way I would now then. But do you have any favorite Friends Talking Nerdy memories?
Oh man, I still go back to, I know we've had quite a journey in how we have thought about episodes and how we've structured them and even topics we've gone over, but I still I really loved some of the topics we've covered, especially when I had my friend, I think his name was Eli. It's been a long time, talking about Pride Month and different perspectives there. One of my old favorites was gun control. We've done some really good ones. I loved when we used to go through the pros and cons list. That was a really good, interesting source of that's I really want to say that's what kind of led to how we got to our current format. of going over pros and cons and trying to really reach and understand the other side, right? Like it just kind of built it naturally to where now our own research is a little bit more lean to, all right, but who opposes this? Like, let's make sure we're checking that side too. And I think that did some interesting programming for us, as it were, for how we think about an episode, even, or how we want to cover it, and try to make sure that we're not completely shutting down anybody's voice. Granted, if you come at me with some crazy cherry picked nonsense trying to support anti vax sentiment, I might tell you, okay, thank you, bye bye. But I want you to at least feel heard.
You sound
I might not
vaxxed.
agree with some of your sources. You've done all your research. That's been some of my favorite. Well, just because it's been hot on Facebook lately, so it's been more on my attention. It's like, okay,
Yeah.
that sure is some cherry picked things that you took from some studies that did not prove that, but okay.
Yeah, I'm glad that the show has allowed me to have more of that focus in everyday life, especially when it comes to like watching the news as well, because I've been open a lot about how I am very much susceptible to echo chamber type of stuff, and I think diving more into the contrary opinion of what I would support has allowed me to see more of the humanity in people, I guess, and see what the actual enemy is, for lack of a better phrase. And, the enemy for me is people that want to pit, average citizen against average citizen, and I think if more people recognize that, then, we'd probably get some real solutions going at the end of the day. But that's a different story for a different day. But for me, like, yeah, we've done a lot. We've been a lot. I mean, I will never, if it wasn't for the show, I don't think I would have necessarily gone up to Seattle to, pay my respects to Kurt Cobain, which was rather emotional for me, just thinking about how it's weird because it was literally 30 years to the day that I arrived at the park next door to his last home. And I just remembered what it was like for me at 17, kind of, hearing that this big time rock star, tragically ended his life, and like how I wasn't able to process that. And it's not like I have fully processed it, but, being there 30 years to the day, for the sake of the show, was kind of therapeutic in a lot of ways, because while I didn't answer any questions, it was more along the lines of enjoy life, keep living. And I'm glad that happened, and also too the fact that started this whole thing because of our eagerness, our love to be able to talk to each other, and then at the first the quarter of the show, that didn't necessarily happen until episode 100. And if you go back in our archives and find out why, folks. But
It took 100 episodes for Tim and I to stop fighting.
yeah,
and I'll
it
even
worked.
own it. It took 100 episodes for me to stop being mad at Tim. I'll own that one. I know you've owned your part of it, but see, this is the healthy things that can happen when you have difficult conversations with somebody you had a fallout over, and you allow some time to recover.
Yeah. Yeah, but
And maybe see where you fit into some of the toxic shit yourself too. So
yeah, and the fact that we can take that energy that we had 9 years ago and still kind of stoke that fire, like that, you know, this is probably the most successful creative endeavor I've ever had. And if I walk out this door and get hit by a bus, it will still be the greatest, creative endeavor I've ever had. It would just be nice to expand the audience and make a little bit of money too.
yeah, it'd be cool if we got didn't have to have our jobs, or this was supplemental. But yeah, we get paid nothing to do this. This is fun. We have intrinsic value right now for doing this podcast, which I think that's where a lot of people maybe don't make it to this number of episodes, because it goes back to what I was learning about raising kids and allowances, and how that might be undercutting learning the skill of intrinsic value. And so therefore, if you're making a podcast, you might really love it, but if you never get that thing that you got taught you should get if it's good, you might quit doing it. So that's where it's like, I'm glad we're very intrinsic value people, or we're very stubborn. It's one of those two things, and only time will tell which one that is, I think.
Well, I mean, I try to keep the mindset of someone, like starting a band. We are the band that plays the corner bar every Monday, plus, occasionally other days, to entertain you with the hopes that maybe someday a music A&R guy that works for a major record label will walk in and listen to us and be like, "Hey, you should go on to bigger and better things," But again,
Hey, we love your style. Now, here's all the things we want you to change about it because you're going corporate now, which is what I would like to try to avoid if we can.
yeah, I get that too. We like doing commercials for like Blue Chew. There are plenty of podcasts that do that.
Oh, no, it'd be super funny if we got like here's your promo code for hungry toddlers, which is like something I would straight say no to because I think that started some of the short order cookness in our house is getting convinced that we need, like, I don't think I could take something that I've actually personally said, maybe this is like a marketing misstep. You know what I mean? I don't think I could do that. But ideally, hopefully, something down the road. It would be nice if this did turn into something like that for us.
It would be nice too, but kind of piggybacking off of what you just said too. It's like a lot of there are videos on YouTube you can watch that detail about how a lot of the companies that do promotions on podcasts and YouTube and stuff like that are very problematic.
Mm-hmm.
Like Shopify was one, and the reason I bring up Shopify, the CEO recently came out and said that, like, basically, if you don't, and I'm paraphrasing here, so I could be wrong, and future Tim will make sure to put the actual quote up on Facebook. But the CEO was talking about how only certain people who make a certain amount of money or something like that should be allowed to vote. Yeah, problematic. Yeah, so I would more than anything love to, if anything, if we do make money off of this, I would love to kind of dive more into the Patreon side of things because that's more of a one-on-one engagement with people that are listening that do want to contribute financially, and I think that could be much more fulfilling too. I mean, that would also involve like bonus episodes and stuff like that. But if we're getting paid, then hey, it's worth it.
Yes, I mean, it goes back to it'd be a nice bonus, but I'm actually pretty proud of us for finding value in doing this anyway. I mean, I've learned a lot doing research for the show. I don't get nothing out of it.
Oh,
I
same here.
get right, like I was already a nerd and wanting to read psychology today anyway. This just kind of gave me like, hey, I'm going to study this on purpose, which when we learned how we actually learn stuff has actually taught me more than just the things that I was picking up in between because of having that focus and spending the time kind of on something across a few days. So, it's been a nice process for me and I've gotten a lot out of it.
Indeed, me as well. And I hope we continue to do this forever and ever and ever, or until the computer breaks. But anyway, anything else you want to say to our friends at home before we wrap things up for another week?
No, I think you've got a great sign off for this one. It was really fun talking about this because it affects everybody. So I'm hoping you got some good takeaways, especially if you're experiencing any burnout in your life.
Agreed. So with that, each week we have something in this podcast space to entertain your ear holes. Until we meet again, we bid you adieu.
Remember, guys, stress isn't the enemy. Exhaustion isn't a moral failure. Needing recovery doesn't mean you're weak.
Subscribe to Friends Talking Nerdy
on YouTube Music, Apple Podcasts, Spotify,
or wherever you listen to podcasts.
Bye, friends.